Hi, my name is Logan Boone, and this is my exam 2 and from History 102. I'd like to start off with Silver in Spanish America, which is chapter 16. First, describe the discovery of silver in Spanish America. Once you've done that, explain why it is so important to the trade at the time. So many countries raced over to the Americas in order to get as many resources as they could. So Spanish laid claims to much of South America, what is known as today South America, and much of Mexico. During that, they discovered a place called Potosi in 1545, and they dubbed it Rich Hill because it contained the largest deposit of silver ever discovered. And they began to extract it, but it is very dangerous because they used mercury at the time to separate the crushed ore from the actual silver itself. And this was very hard. It's very toxic and hard on the human body, so they implemented a draft system using indigenous peoples and slaves, known as the Mita and the Repartimiento. It was a draft. They were both drafts, and the Mita is a Spanish revival of the Inca draft labor system, which required them to spend 1 year in Potosi and 6 years in their home region, working for the Spanish. But it was still very costly, despite the fact that they paid very minimum wages to their forced labor. So gold is panned, which is a much cheaper alternative than silver, because silver requires massive investments for the large machinery and the mining and excavating that takes place. So they had to invest lots of money in order to get anything out of it. But it was worth it because silver is a very valuable trade currency that was commonly used back then as money. And this gave Spanish America lots of trade power and allowed them to be semi-autonomous from Spain because they had such an influx of money coming in from their mines. And this later connects to the Indian trade network because that's what Asian countries wanted from European countries, was the Spanish American silver that they had mined. Moving on to the Portuguese slave trade, chapter 17. First, explain the early Portuguese slave trade in Western Africa. Once you have explain how it functioned. Well, in the early 1400s, this Portuguese arrived in Western Africa in search of gold and a faster trade route to India. They established many trading outposts where they traded gold, ivory, and slaves. That was not the main focus at the time, but they did trade off slaves. They used intermediaries, so they didn't directly trade with other Asian or Middle Eastern countries or India, for example. They traded through African leaders. So they would trade directly with the African leaders, but the African leaders would have resources coming in, trade goods coming in from other countries. So through them, they were trading with other countries. However, the economy switched mainly to focus on slaves because they were more profitable, because there was such a high demand for labor in the Americas because plantations were being established. So because there was such a high demand, then they started focusing on slaves. So they would go to African tribe leaders and trade them cloths and gold and some of the silver that they had gotten from Spanish America. They would trade that for other African Americans. They would enslave them and ship them off through the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is the Atlantic crossing made by slaves taken from Africa to the Americas. They would trade them off, and that is how they would make their money. And it is part of the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which is what I'm about to talk about. Chapter 18 was the Indian Trade Network, Ocean Trade Network. First, explain the Indian Ocean Trade Network and how it functioned. Once you have done that, explain how the arrival of Europeans in this network changed how it functioned. So the trade was between many countries: India, Africa, specifically the western part where Portugal had established trade posts, Asian countries, Middle East, and Europe. So at first, the Asian countries mainly they had no interest in any of the goods besides guns and clocks that the Europeans had to offer. Later, they caught up on their technology, so they weren't even interested in that. They were really interested in European gold and silver, specifically the silver that Spanish America had begun mining. And the Europeans would trade this off for ivory, cloth, spices, ceramics from Asia. They would trade these off. But once this became known, once the Indian trade network became really known to Europeans, they kind of inserted themselves as the dominant force, establishing lots of trading posts that enforced tariffs and taxes upon incoming ships. For example, the Dutch Trading Company, they made a pass that if you didn't have the pass, they were going to take all your goods. But if you did have it, then you were fine. And they used the Dutch used their large navy, and so did Portugal. They used their large navy to set up monopolies on their goods and on these trading posts. And it kind of killed the Indian Ocean Trade Network, especially when they started shipping off so many African Americans that it left Africa ruined. It left it in shambles because they shipped them all off. And that leads me into the Reformation, chapter 19. Your perspective, describe the most impactful outcome of the Protestant Reformation and explain why, in your perspective, it was the most impactful. So I think that the 30 Years' War had the most impact because it eventually led to freedom of religion, because the countries were able to pick what religion they wanted. So in 1618 to 1648, the war started originally as a war between Catholics and Protestants, and it heavily reshaped the borders of Europe at the time. But throughout the war, the motives changed for many countries. They focused more on political gains and how they could help their own country and expand their borders rather than Catholics versus Protestants. That was just the initial spark of the war. This was caused by the Protestant Reformation, and it was led by Martin Luther, who wanted to separate himself and his followers from the Catholic Church because they believed that the Catholic Church had strayed too far off of the teachings from the Bible. So they did not believe in a thing called indulgences, which were sold by the Catholic Church. In early modern Europe, a note sold by the Catholic Church to speed a soul's exit from purgatory. They did not believe in that, which I don't either, but they did not believe that was the thing. So they formed their own church, such as the Lutheran Church. And another person that followed was John Calvin. He formed Calvinism and formed his own church. But this was very hard on the civilians because it cost a lot of money there was a lot of church shifting, and the actual war itself was hard on civilians. And after the war was eventually fought and over, they came up with the Peace of Westphalia, which gave countries the country's leaders the freedom to choose their own religion, which took a lot of power away from the Roman Catholic Church. And so now the Protestant Church was on the rise, and it gave way to the formation of new denominations. And that's all I got. Thank you.